I don't do PowerPoints anymore. So it's so this is I was invited to share some history of AAPSE, and as Faye said, I've been involved with the organization, a fellow life member, past treasurer, past president, board representative, and my new role is as a contributing editor with Gypsy as history and legacy. And I do have some academic background in historical research into science and technology, which was one of the reasons that attracted me. And of course, I was at Minnesota. I use original sources because that's what historians do. And I want to give credit to folks, particularly Mike Weaver, and the national stakeholder team had some great historical documents. I actually read the congressional record when the FIFRA was amended to create RUPs and certification, both the House and Senate discussion, which is absolutely fascinating to me. And of course, I've been doing this since 1987, so I was in the room. And Ed and Clyde and Jack, you need to chime in and make sure I'm honest, because you guys go back in time. So I'm going to focus on three things in this quick presentation: how AAPSE emerged out of extension pesticide education certification programs. A significant event in AAPSE's history was our ability to work with stakeholders and obtain PREA funding for PSEPs. And also, really why one of the big reasons we're here today is how changes in membership in the organization over the years has changed the organization. That ties directly into the strategic plan that we're going to be discussing today. And like Patsy, I was on the strategic plan committee as well. Very quickly, FIFRA. There's a whole history of pesticide regulation. FIFRA was probably the big event, 1947, new era of regulation that started the modern regulation of pesticides. APCO formed that year. There's an important role of APCO in AAPSE's history. USDA is the federal lead agency, and this Model A Farmall was the tractor, not this exact one, but the tractor that I learned how to drive tractor on, this exact model. And if you can see the bright red wheel, that's caught my eye because 1947, there was no red paint because of World War II. And my tractor that I grew up with, my grandpa bought, is tan. And it sits in my son's suburban Twin Cities garage, and my 7-year-old grandson probably tells everybody he's got a tractor that his great-great-grandpa Herzfeld bought. So I thought things have changed since 1947. This is significant that in 1960, USDA extension, I'm using that for what we call now NIFA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture. The name has changed over the years, so I'm just using USDA extension. Formally request land grant university extension services to establish a pesticide education coordinator. It was 1960 when the program started. To receive, interpret, and disseminate information regarding pesticides to those using, because in the late 50s, there was significant public growing concern over the use of pesticides. And there was a number of spectacular events. The late 50s, there was the Thanksgiving without cranberries because there was a misuse on cranberries, and nobody ate cranberries. I think it was 1958 because of pesticide misuse in the United States. Then this happened. Which was probably the most significant event. And of course, Rachel Carson focused on insecticide use and effect on the environment. And interestingly enough, she was not against pesticides. If you spend any time going into Rachel Carson and her background, she was not against pesticides. She was against their indiscriminate use of pesticides. And she actually worked for the US, what we now call US Fish and Wildlife, in the 1940s when they did the original research studies that linked DDT to raptor egg thinning. She was their, what we would now call a communication writer person for what is now US Forest Service at the time. So she was dealing with that for a long time in her career. Huge national hubbub. Congress, literally in response to Silent Spring, provided funding to Extension to expand, to support the extension coordinators and expand the pesticide education programs that had started in 1960. To mitigate harm from pesticides by educating applicators. It was the first time pesticide application manuals were developed, starting in 1964, the national level, and they provided $1 million, which is astonishing that it's almost $8.5 million in today's money back in the day. We could only dream of that today. During the 60s, this is sort of inside baseball for those of us in extension. This state extension services have primacy, not USDA or cooperative extension, and where the state directors of extension meet and develop national policy and everything is through an association called the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities now. And they have what's called the Extension Committee on Policy, where it's all extension directors, and they established a National Pesticide Education Task Force and 4 different individuals that were liaisons between the regions, pesticide coordinators, and ECOP, so that there was good communication and guidance and integration with extension directors nationally. In 1968, a few states created a certification program with extension because they were already doing the education. Basically, the certification program was run by extension with the SLAs involved, and it was all over the place because it was independently done by the state. Whoops, I went the wrong way. Why am I going the wrong way? Here we go. Early 70s, Nixon creates EPA by executive order, and at that, when he created it, pesticide regulation moved from USDA to EPA. FIF was amended in 72, creating certification, creating restricted use pesticides and the certification program with the explicit purpose to provide additional education. I want to emphasize that. The idea was that these were hazardous products that were slated to be canceled. And there was a big outcry, and they came up with this idea of restricted use pesticides that would bring additional education so that applicators would have a higher level of education and be able to use these products safely. And to do that, they needed to have a certification program to bring them to education. Late 70s, FIFRA was amended that EPA shall use the extension service coordinating with USDA for pesticide safety education and regulatory outreach, which still exists today. First time EPA funds with EPA discretionary money to PAT programs. First national meeting, pesticide applicator coordinators, was actually in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the same hotel we held our Y2K NCR meeting. The year 2000, we held the regional meeting. And Norm Meschheim cornered me and said, do you know that this is the hotel we first met and designed the certification program back in the 70s? I didn't know that. EPA classifies 12 pesticides as the first RUPs. This is, I love this picture. This is the 1983, what is now, this is our regional meetings that we still hold today. They started way back in the day. They were extension PAT coordinators. And if you can see, there's a very young Mike Weaver sitting there, third from the left in the back row next to a very young Wayne Hawk from Penn State. Mike actually worked, I don't remember which state it was in the Northeast before he went to Virginia Tech, and I'm not sure if that's Amy Brown or not. I know she worked in Michigan before she went to Maryland. I'm not sure. There's probably a couple other names, but
it is Dean.
Is it Amy?
Yeah.
So Amy, 1983. It was all extension. USDA established a national program leader that provided very strong leadership for the pesticide applicator training side of the program. And actually that national program leader was the primary host for our national meetings up until, and that changed later on. State extension is providing the certification program with SLA, providing regulatory and compliance. And you'll know, I'll comment on how that started changing in the early 90s. Regional meetings, ECOP eliminates the national task force and the liaisons, which was created a disconnect between the extension directors and one of the largest extension programs in the United States. AAPSE begins in 1991 at the national meeting in Arlington, Virginia, where Barry Brennan, University of Hawaii coordinator, who's the father of the organization, calls together a meeting of the pesticide applicator training coordinators. At that meeting, at the end of that meeting, I was in the room, and the term that was used over and over again was that we needed an organization to provide PAT coordinators a voice at the table. That was the primary theme. There were some other things too, but that was the primary thing, because this is on the AAPSE website if you want to actually read I think Mike Weaver has it labeled as a charter. Strong support from APCO. In fact, it was APCO that was instrumental in thinking up this idea, and the USDA leadership representative was strongly supportive of doing so. It passed, we did a motion, charter committee was put together, and you can read some of the minutes of the charter committee as you scroll down in that document that's on the AAPSE website. And we had, for many years, for a couple of decades, we had heavy involvement from provincial and federal government in Canada involved in the organization, which we really don't have anymore. 1993, the Constitution's developed, which is now the bylaws, replaced the Constitution. Much that was in the Constitution is in the bylaws, and Clyde will talk about that later. Board of directors were elected. Officers began work on the bylaws and articles of incorporation and operations. Win Hawk, Amy Brown, Norm Neschheim from Florida, Barry Brennan, and then Mary Grodner. There were other significant players, Larry Schultz, Mac Horton, particularly from Clemson. I'm forgetting probably a couple of other major players who were put the organization together. From the original Constitution, the primary purpose of the association shall be, this is a quote, to represent the interest of land-grant colleges and university pesticide educators. There were some other things that we still do about promoting quality pesticide safety education and so on that you will see in the current bylaws, but this was the primary purpose. GIPSE was an idea from the founding of the organization, and Mike Weaver was a force of nature on GIPSE. Can't give him enough credit for it, to advance pesticide education, a core membership benefit, so you could have a place to do peer-reviewed publications. And promote AAPSE. And this was because pesticide applicator coordinators were almost universally tenured faculty members in academic departments back in the day. And so they had this environment of working in scientific and professional associations. This is different than APCO and ASPRO. This is a different piece that is right from the founding of the organization. I'm going to do a shameless plug. Faye and I were talking a little bit about this morning. This is from the original Constitution. It remains almost identical in the current bylaws. The board shall be responsible for interpreting the provisions of this Constitution and its bylaws, entering into affiliation agreements, approving budgets, authorizing disbursements, formulating policy, and advising the president on all matters concerning the organization. What this means is, unlike APCO, we are a membership-driven organization. The members elect the board of directors, and the board of directors is actually primacy over the EC in this organization. And I'm going to do a shameless plug that we should move back to this concept of the board having that primacy of providing guidance to the EC and be actively engaged in all aspects of the organization. There have been times in our organization where the EC really became secondary and was not highly engaged in the leadership of the organization. I think there's been an effort by Faye and some of your immediate predecessors to bring back the importance of the board representing the membership in their regions, because we are a membership-driven organization, quite different than APCO and ASPRO, and this has consequences for the strategic plan. Why? There is a growing number of complex issues that were directly affecting PAT programs and certification that we felt we needed a voice for. A general sense that APCO and the SPI-REG system was focused on SLAs, and that extension programs really didn't have an organized voice within that system. This was not a criticism, it just was the nature of the beast, because APCO is highly supportive of creating AAPSE. And this was something that was really significant at the time. USDA, ECOP, the extension directors, and EPA saw certification as a legacy, aging, old program. With the rise of sustainable agriculture and the increasing push for IPM, that they wanted to move away from the negative connotations that we work with pesticides or promoted pesticides in view of the changing climate in the country. So we've always been a place of our own for mentoring and addressing the issues of the day. I love this photo of Don Renshie, Jim Criswaller, and I'm not sure who the other two individuals are, I apologize, but the guy doesn't look terribly excited, the guy in the blue shirt, but if any of you know Don Renshie, and he's a force of nature too within the organization. And this was one of the largest benefits of the organization, to meet other people who had similar interest in certification, whether we were SLAs or we were extension, and have that camaraderie and fellowship, because the people who understood my job the best were not in Minnesota at the university, they were the coordinators in other states. And it made a huge difference in my career. AAPSE actually initiated this discussion to create CTAG, had an extended list of discussions in 2000, 2001. At the time, John Impson was signaling that USDA extension was looking at phasing down or even phasing out the national program leader role, and there would be a leadership vacuum, and really supported the idea of creating CTAG. In fact, I, being very a little bit un-Minnesotan-like, claimed the title of actually naming CTAG at the original discussion meeting in I think it was a spring APCO meeting. We broke off and talked about this, and later was formed under the auspices of EPA and funded by EPA. But AAPSE took this on because they saw USDA extension stepping back significantly. 2002, the name was changed to Pesticide Safety Education. This was a signature event. There was almost universal agreement. There were a lot of reasons about this, and if you want to get wonky over a beverage tonight, as a PhD in education, I can talk about the difference between education and training. I'll just say my wife's an RN. She said, we RNs are trained, we don't have RN training, we're educated. We train dogs, we don't train RNs. And that sums up the distinction. But AAPSE began addressing the growing loss of funding at the same, both SLAs and extension, and the expanding demands on our programs that started around 2000. There became a wider and wider disconnect between support and what we were asked to do. And that's another whole discussion. In 2006 and 2007, under Joanne Kickrack from Ohio State, PA coordinator, the Ohio State, I apologize, the Ohio State University, I always forget the Joanne was amazing at networking with national stakeholder groups. This was something a lot of people felt strongly should happen. The PREA funds are the registration fees that registrants pay to EPA, and Congress designates how those funds should be used. A portion of those registration fees in federal regulations goes to organizations that deal with issues of pesticides. So at that time, most of those discretionary PREA funding was directed by Congress to farm labor organizations. And there was strong interest that some of those should go to PSEPs because of the declining funding we were receiving from EPA and elsewhere. And we did an informational campaign. I actually led that. I was treasurer. We wrote letters to every member of Congress on the House and Senate committees that had to vote this out to be voted on by Congress. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, which meant we could only do education. We could not lobby. And many organizations went to bat for this. And particularly the American Farm Bureau pulled out all the stops, and we were successful. This was in an era where EPA literally zeroed out their funding of PSEPs to run the program. So there were a couple of years where the only funding we received were the PREA funds from the federal government. This put AAPSE on the map in a way that nothing else had ever done, and gained respect for the organization that we were serious and we were a force to be reckoned with.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'll get on here.
There's a question here. Patsy's getting her mic lined up. And
so Dean, you mentioned funding to farm labor organizations. I almost feel like it's come full circle a little bit with some of the funding that's going to some of the other organizations that don't do pure pesticide safety education that were represented at the PACT meeting. Can you address that a little bit?
Well, that's sort of off topic, but I will make a comment about that. I was heavily involved with the National Pesticide Safety Education Center up until this summer, and actually led the committee that developed the center. It was all pesticide applicator training coordinator, or sorry, a PSEP coordinator. Still have the habit of PAT. And the center was successful in partnering with the Extension Foundation to receive the EPA's meetings grant. There's 5 grants that EPA sends out around pesticide education and certification, and one was to support meetings for CTAG and WPS and the national meeting and so on. And in that grant directive from EPA was to significantly broaden the stakeholders that we reached out to and brought in. So that came from EPA, built into the grant RFP. And we were required to have partners. And so the center partnered with, senior moment. There's a Farm Worker Association. Migrant Conditions Network. But that was the basis of the grant. So EPA really wanted to have a broader stakeholder engagement with the meetings grant process. And so that's one of the reasons why we had a lot of other people in the room. And historically, the national meeting was our little niche of extension, SLA, EPA, so that we could let everything out and deal with everything. But over the years, it's been a gradual involvement in the national meeting by people who are not that. But anyway, that's a good question. Yeah, it fits into the strategic plan discussion, I think, because the membership that I'm going to talk about in just a second, the membership changes of the organization, it actually fits in with that. So there were a lot of tensions back in the day of having non-SLA, non-university people involved, because we felt very comfortable and free sharing everything. But when you had external stakeholders in the room, that changed the conversation, and there was people who were for it and against it. And it remains a tension within the organization. This is one of my favorite AAPSE pictures. Whoops. There we go. I don't even remember what meeting this was, but that's Joanne Kickrack's big face. And we had a large group of us. We needed to get from point A to point B for dinner, and we were going to have to get 3 taxis, and was astronomical. And Joanne goes, a stretch limousine would be a lot cheaper. And up pulls the stretch limousine, mirror on the ceilings, bar, and there was some negative reaction to posting this on the AAPSE website by Mike Weaver, but we had a lot of fun. You could see the guy with the mustache halfway back on the left. That happened to be me, and Carrie Richards is next to me, and Plez is leaning in, Plez Bradley, to get involved. And we had a lot of fun in that stretch limousine ride, but it was significantly cheaper than getting 3 taxis. So, yes. So we are a membership-driven organization, and this is important for the strategic plan. And this is the San Diego national meeting. Back a long time ago, and you'll see, I don't know if you can see, but there's some very young looking folks in this photo. Candace Bartholomew, Mike Weaver, I mean, just a whole bunch of people. Jim Dale's right up in front. The person that's standing second row on the left with the black blazer and white shirt, the gal, that's Wendy Winterstein. She was pesticide coordinator, Iowa State Extension Specialist, corn insects, a Kansas gal. She suffered no fools. And she was my primary mentor when I became a coordinator in Minnesota. She took me under her wing. She did not suffer fools. She said it like it was and let people have it. And she spent 1 year as acting national program leader at USDA Extension for the program. And she is now president of Iowa State University. So that's the kind of person she was. And I just wanted to recognize her and her role in the development of the organization. The original AAPSE membership, we had full members, voting members, associate members, retired members, international members, life members. The ones with the asterisks we really don't have anymore. There was some sense because we had a lot of Canadians involved, and in Canada, the provinces have more authority than the federal government over regulatory issues in Canada because they're more of a federation. And we had a very active involvement, particularly from Ontario and Manitoba for years, and the federal government as well. So I'm going to just go into this a little bit. Only extension educators at land-grant universities involved with PAT programs were eligible as full members because we're a voice for land-grant universities. 1 person in each state was designated as a voting member, the coordinator, and allowed to vote. This created a lot of tensions because there was a diversity of opinion, to be Minnesota nice about it, within state delegations. And it became a huge issue within the organization. And this reflected APCO model, where the state is the primary membership unit. That's how APCO works. And that was the APCO influence. Again, APCO was very supportive and was very involved in setting up AAPSE. So that changed. I haven't been able to nail down the date, if it was 95 or 96, but by 1996, looking at some of the minutes and so on, that had changed, that all full members could vote on everything. And that changed the organization because there was concern that some states would dominate and all of this. Well, that never really came to pass if we didn't have one state, one vote. We had another major membership change, which I was referred to in 1999, where full membership and voting privileges were extended to employees of local, state, federal, and tribal government employees involved in a recognized EPA certification program. And there was a need to bring a voice to the table from the folks who ran the SLA certification program. We in Extension were part of the pre-SCI-RIG system, but typically the certification SLA folks were not the people who attended. And we would carry water for the SLA certification program in the forums that we were at from the AAPSE side. Growing regulatory involvement in the certification program, particularly in the educational side, which they had gradually became much more significant, and the growing importance starting around this time of exams for certification competency and program accountability. It was in this time where we started improving the exam process, and they became much more significant in the certification process compared to the focus almost exclusively on education before this. In 2015, a very controversial vote removed all restrictions to AAPSE full membership and voting privileges were removed. There were years of discussion on this, and there were very strong feelings. There were very strong feelings about bringing in government employees too, because this was an organization to represent Extension PSAPs. But there was so much integration, you couldn't draw a line. There was a number of benefits of having SLA people, particularly in the room as members, strengthening the voice of the organization for the whole certification program. That was the logic behind that. This was all over the place. People had all kinds of opinions, and it went on for a long time. And the AAPSE leadership actually asked me to write a white paper and have conversations with members to line up the pros and cons and present it formally to the board and the membership. And Drew Martin assisted me with this from Purdue. And there were all kinds of things that people were saying about this and felt very strongly one way or the other. It came down to really that the organization had a choice. And everybody kind of understood this. If we stay the status quo, we were going to remain a small organization with a smaller voice. And more of the education, safety education, especially for certification, was happening outside of the extension system with private sector trainers and industry groups and so on. And that group was not represented or in the organization when we talked about certification. So that was a major argument too, that was important to bring that group. But really another aspect was there was a real desire to bring a stronger diversity of input, ideas, thought that really focused on the whole certification program. A lot of project stewardship folks from registrants were very involved in our work. And again, many states had private sector trainers that did certification. They weren't allowed, they could be associate members, non-voting associate, couldn't run for office, they could be on committees, but they couldn't vote on membership issues at the membership. And couldn't vote for president or the officers. So it was very controversial, very divisive. And the other option was if we expand membership, the organization could grow in ways that was never envisioned, become stronger and have a stronger voice, and do more to develop the quality of pesticide education more broadly. And it passed. And it was I suppose, I'm just pulling maybe Jack or Ed or Clyde can remember, but it was sort of like 1/3 no, that 1/3, maybe 40% no. So, I mean, it wasn't close, but there was a sizable majority that voted against this. And we're still dealing with some of those tensions today because suddenly as a PSEP coordinator, I had competitors, private sector competitors who did not have a public mission. I'm just throwing this out. I'm not picking and choosing which were the most profitable groups to do their programs for. But I had a public mission, as did the SLAs, that was very different than the private sector. And that was a big part of the discussion within the organization. But it brought in a much broader, diverse set of voices, and the feeling we needed to work together with all these folks in order to promote pesticide safety education and the certification program. And that was the argument that went out. So we are a diverse, membership-driven organization. This issue of membership drove the strategic plan committee of how do we represent all members of the organization in an organization that to this day we have SLA folks who see it primarily as a PSEP program, much less everybody else that we've now brought in. And so the strategic plan committee spent a lot of time discussing this and came up with this idea that we should move from being focused on pesticide safety educators that was very narrowly defined. I mean, Patsy, you said you didn't see yourself as a pesticide safety educator, yet you were heavily involved, to being more like a scientific and professional association and focus on the work of pesticide safety education. That was the change from pesticide safety educator to pesticide safty education, was sort of the soundbite for the strategic plan that has been adopted. So now the work is implementing the strategic plan so that the organization represents all its members. And that's where we are at today.
That is a great recap. That's incredible.
Do I need to do something here?
Well, first, want to see if anyone has any questions or comments from Dean's presentation. I think you've captured everything about this organization. And Dean always hears me mention that, you know, we have leaders. We have Mike, we have Jack. But to me, Dean is the conscience of AAPSE. I mean, he just embodies that to me. We have a comment from Chrissy, very interesting and comprehensive. Thank you, Chrissy. Does anyone have any questions in the room or virtually?
Yeah, so I have a